Carson, what do you think of the briefing?
Well, the briefings were, of course, I can't tell you a lot about the briefings because it's classified, but the basic theme of it was the administration essentially saying, trust us. And that's really what it all boils down to. I'm not sure who I trust or what I trust when it comes to these issues because we've been told so many different things that really just bother me. One of the things that I know a lot of people are very unhappy with is the AUMF back in 2001, 2002. If this is justification for having more hostilities, we're essentially reopening the Iraq War again. And I think a lot of us feel very uncomfortable with that. So there are lots of unanswered questions. Again, some of them I cannot discuss with you, but I'm not sure that trust me is the satisfactory answer for me.
So what legislation are you backing at this point?
No, we haven't. We're going to sit down and put our heads together and figure out what we are doing. But the Foreign Affairs Committee is going to hold hearings next week to try to get to the bottom of this. We've invited Secretary Pompeo to come. I hope he does. If he doesn't, we're going to go along with the hearing anyway, because the American people have the right to know.
Do you intend to subpoena him if he doesn't attend?
It's a possibility. We haven't made any decision on that.
After hearing what you heard today in the briefing, do you think that the strike was justified, and do you think that there was an imminent threat?
Well, we're told there was an imminent threat. I'm not sure I'm convinced about that. Look, the person we took out is no sweetheart, and was no fan of his, and I'm no fan of the Iranian regime. The question is, do we want to get sucked into another war? The past 20 years or so, we've been really preoccupied with war after war, and I'm not convinced that this is any different or much different than what we've experienced for the past 20 years. And if we're using the old AUMFs to continue to do this, then what we're really saying is we have perpetual war that's never going to end. And that is certainly not acceptable to me, and I think to the majority of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle.
Were you satisfied with the president's speech today? Did you feel like he was kind of stepping back a little bit?
It's hard to say. I mean, I have questions. We have questions. I don't think our questions are really being answered. So, thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Him over and over do actions that have put it at greater risk. The JCPOA, for example, had us in a much better place, in a safer place in that region and in the world because we had an agreement going forward. By getting rid of that agreement, we have seen things happen in the region that didn't need to happen because the president had a bad decision, and we're living with that over and over. The president said he was going to end these endless wars and bring troops home. And in the last 6 months, depending on the number you look at, 14 to 15,000 more people are in the Middle East right now than they were 6 months ago. Again, leading to distrust on this president and his understanding of this region. And we have, as a progressive caucus, especially leaving this briefing where, again, no information was given on the imminent threat. What we were told, and this is something I think you've all been told, is this decision was made on Article 2 and on the 2002 AUMF. And they're continuing to say that is the rationale, plus information they have, which they have yet to give to us. When I went to the SCIF this morning and read the thin 2 pages of information, there was nothing in there that described an imminent threat. And out of all of this, we are in a less safe place. So the Progressive Caucus has endorsed the following: a strong war powers resolution, some form of resolution that gives the power explicitly back to Congress to do what we are supposed to do per Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Second, we have endorsed Representative Khanna's efforts that we had tried to do in the NDAA to explicitly say we're not going to get involved in Iran. And also we have endorsed Barbara Lee's efforts to repeal the 2002 AUMF, which I might add, Barbara, we tried to do an Appropriations Committee a few years back, and virtually every single person, Democrat and Republican, on the committee voted to do that. And it went to get to the full Congress, and Paul Ryan single-handedly took that out of that bill, and we could have had this taken care of a long time ago. But those are the efforts that we are recommending. We are not satisfied. We have been given information that is compelling, imminent threat information. We are not convinced that the president acted correctly, and that's why Congress has to, after quite a long period of giving up our jurisdiction, take that back, and that should be done in a bipartisan way. With that, I would like to introduce a woman who's been really at the forefront of I think all of our times in Congress on peace and justice issues, who has been the hardest and strongest voice when it comes to repealing the 2002 AUMF, and that is Representative Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our co-chairs, Congressman Pocan and Pramila Jayapal, for your tremendous leadership on so many issues that really have become issues that are quite central to our Democratic caucus and should be bipartisan, actually, in many, many ways. So I want to thank you all for your leadership. I also want to associate myself with all of the remarks that have been made already, and also just say how relieved I am that our military personnel, Iraqis, our allied forces, that there are no casualties so far as we know it. And this should be a wake-up call in terms of this cycle of violence. It has got to stop, and we must de-escalate. Let me go back very quickly to the 2002 authorization to use military force. First of all, probably less than 25% of members of Congress here today were here in 2002, and which means they have not had the opportunity to voice their opinion or cast their vote for any authorizations to use military force for their constituents. The House passed the 2002 authorization to use military force based on the Bush administration's beating the war drums, indicating that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was the basis upon which that 2002 resolution was passed. Myself, I introduced an amendment to that said, look, at least let's wait until the inspection process is completed. Let us determine whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before we move to authorize the use of force. Well, from what I remember, I got maybe 72, 73 votes on that amendment. Had we voted to hold up and to wait until the inspections process was completed, we would have learned that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But the Congress, unfortunately, in its rush to judgment, voted to authorize. However, there were probably 132, 133 votes, mostly Democrats, who voted against that authorization. And so that authorization never intended, even as bad as it was then, given that there were no weapons of mass destruction, never authorized the use of force against any country, any hostile country, or any country that was based or had personnel or officials or a presence in Iran or any other country. And so that is why we've worked for years and years and years to repeal the 2002 authorization to use military force. And as Congressman Pocan just mentioned, we did this a couple of years ago. And of course, then the Trump administration, along with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, just took that out of the bill. So fast forward to just last year, we were able, with the vote of, I believe it was about 241, 242 votes, bipartisan, put this repeal once again in the National Defense Authorization Act. That passed the House. It went to the Senate. Senator McConnell, the Trump administration, again conspired together, and they took that out of the bill. And so couple of things about that. U.S. deployments and operations carried out pursuant to the 2002 AUMF that was dubbed, remember, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that officially ended in 2011. We should have never been there. But the United States then did recognize the sovereignty of Iraq and considers the Iraqi government a key ally. So we've known for years that there's no military solution in the Middle East, and it's time to return to a diplomatic strategy with our allies. Yet we have Secretary Pompeo, who's the chief diplomat, he's the Secretary of State, acting as if diplomacy is not part of his portfolio, unfortunately. Finally, I just have to mention a couple of things that the Department of Defense, their statement on January 2nd, in terms of imminent versus non-imminent versus Article 2 versus the authorization to use force, what they said, and this is their official statement, they said this strike was aimed at deterring future Iranian attack plans. No mention of imminent threat in the Defense Department statement. It says the United States will continue to take all necessary action to protect our people and our interests wherever they are around the world. My question is, did they mean based on prior hostilities? Did they mean this was an imminent threat, or did they mean future Iranian attacks in terms of their justification? So we need to repeal the 2002 authorization, and we need to force the Congress to come back and debate the costs and consequences of the use of force if, in fact, we're going to continue down this track of military actions against Iran. And so, having said that, I'd like to introduce now a key leader in this whole effort who has worked so hard to make sure that we deny the funding to the administration as it relates to the military action that is taking place in Iran unless they come to Congress for authorization. Congressman Ro Khanna, thank you very much.
It's an honor to follow Barbara Lee. I often say if a sequel to Profiles in Courage is ever written, Barbara Lee would be chapter 1 for her solitary vote.
Amen. Yep.
Let's also be very clear. If the Congress had listened to the Progressive Caucus, the killing of Soleimani would never have happened and the escalation would never have happened. So the lesson is that Congress needs to listen to the Progressive Caucus more often. But we fought collectively, everyone on this stage fought for two things. We fought to say that you would repeal the 2002 authorization of force, the very justification that the administration is relying on. And we fought to say that you would have not a single dime to take an offensive strike against Iran or any Iranian official. And the remarkable thing is that passed the House with 27 Republicans, with people like Matt Gaetz, Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, the president's closest allies. And our leaders, Mark Buchanan and Pramila Jayapal, said that do not give a blank check to the Pentagon for $738 billion without a restriction and a commitment that they won't go into Iran. Now, does anyone believe that the Pentagon would have given the Soleimani killing as an option if they hadn't gotten their $738 billion? The day we gave them the money without any restriction is the day they thought they had a blank check. And we now know why they fought tooth and nail to get those amendments removed. Because they wanted the flexibility to have the freedom to plan at any time, at any place, an attack on Iran. Now, why does the history matter? The history matters because at some point, Congress needs to learn our lesson and actually step up and say that we have the power of the purse. We have the ability to defund any offensive action against Iran or any of these wars. And that's what the Progressive Caucus is fighting for. We are making a very simple point. People say, well, what is your policy in Iran? You're just for repealing things. You're just for defunding. No, we have a very clear policy. End the maximum pressure campaign. Get back into the JCPOA. Responsibly remove our troops from Iraq and from Syria. Make sure that we're engaged in a ceasefire, as Representative Jayapal talked about, and diplomacy. We know that was working. It was working under the Obama administration. So we have a clear policy, and we understand that, the Iranian economy, this is what I find mind-boggling for a president who talks about pivoting to China. The Iranian economy is 0.44% of global GDP. We're at 21% of global GDP. China is at 15%. Future historians are going to scratch their head and say, what in the world were we thinking? To be obsessed with a region that's 3.5%, the entire Middle East, of the global economy. Well, China hasn't been in a war since 1979. And we've been in nearly 40 conflicts. So I believe that the Progressive Caucus is going to articulate a new vision of foreign policy for our nation. And it's one that's consistent with a weariness of war overseas and a focus on building up our nation and investing in our country. With that, I want to introduce someone who has shown remarkable leadership along with Representative Barbara Lee and is going to be one of the critical people shaping our War Powers resolution that I think will have broad support in the caucus, Representative Omar.
Thank you, Ro. I feel ill a little bit because of everything that is taking place, and I think every time I hear about conversations around war, I find myself being stricken with PTSD. And I find peace knowing that I serve with great advocates for peace and people who have shown courage against war. In 1946, shortly after the United Nations was established with the goal of preventing future armed conflict, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to his congressman. He said, quote, "You cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war." He said, "The very prevention of war requires more faith, courage, and resolution than are needed to prepare for war. We owe it to the American people to prevent war and not prepare for more war. This is what is needed to keep our country safe. Today, our president is failing to heed the warnings of Einstein. Since he got into office, the president of the United States has been goading Iran into war. First, he canceled our best shot at avoiding armed conflict, the Iran nuclear deal. Then he announced crippling sanctions to starve the innocent people of Iran. And whether he publicly says he wants nothing to do with wars or that he wants to end endless wars, we know that his actions are contradictory to his statements because every single person he surrounded himself with has been itching to go to war with Iran. And this is a man who is both an arsonist and a fireman. He starts a crisis, then he wants to create the appearance of wanting to solve it. He's done that here. Our ability to fight ISIS has also been eroded because of the suspension of the Iran nuclear deal. The occupant of the White House has not done a single thing to stabilize the region. He has done everything to create more tension. We are no more safer today than we were yesterday. There are basic questions that still exist after we went into our briefing. Did the intelligence support an imminent attack? As you've heard from my colleagues, we did not get a clear answer to that. Did the elimination of Soleimani eliminate the threat? We still have not heard a clear answer to that. Did we take precautions to make sure American troops and personnel on the ground were protected before carrying out this attack? We still don't have a clear answer. Public record has said that we've asked them to evacuate after the action was taken. In what authority were we able to execute and prosecute this attack? It is clear from this briefing and what we have heard from this administration that this attack was motivated by blind ideology and not facts. We know that previous administrations did a cross-benefit analysis on whether to assassinate Soleimani, and their assessment was that he wasn't worth the trouble. That has been the assessment of the Israelis and other allies, as we've learned. Many have wanted the opportunity to take him out and known he is a malicious actor. So what made this different? That it didn't require clear deliberation of what was going to be the consequence and not allow for a notification and consultation with Congress. Why don't we have any of these clear answers? We hope the American people will continue to ask for answers. Instead, we're hearing spin, the same spin that led us into the Iraq War. So you might have noticed that the media asks for a question and moves on without getting a clear answer from the administration. And what we hope is that the American people will not stop asking questions until they have clear answers. We caution against war because our allegiance to this country and our oath to protect it. Sending teenagers to die or return with lifelong wounds, seen and unseen, is not what it is to carry out our oath. Risking a regional or even global war is not what it means to carry out our oath to protect the American people. I always say war does not have a reset button. Oftentimes, people deal with oppressive, regressive, dangerous leaders. War is never the answer to saving more lives. War destroys lives. It takes away futures and it destroys generations. I know this. I've learned that lesson at the young age of 8. And many of the people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and around the world also know this lesson. The world is asking us to act differently this time. And it's our duty to show up and make sure we do. Thank you. And I think we're going to open up to some questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our members. And so we're open for questions. And
can you explain a little bit more about how they're using the 2002 authorization as justification as opposed to the 2001?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara, but I'll tell you the thing that bothers me is that the 2002 authorization is being used to imply that any action that takes place in Iraq qualifies under the 2002 authorization, even though this is against Iran, which theoretically would mean that any country that is within Iraq performing any duty there, or good or bad, would actually be covered under the 2002 authorization. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
No, that's absolutely correct. I have heard some administration officials say 2001 and 2002. The 2001 was 60 words. It was so overly broad until it's been used over 41 times in a declassified report in 19 countries. And so they go back and forth. But generally, I think the 2002 is the one that, because it was Iraq, that this action occurred.
Yes. Talking to Chairman Engel, he's going to have hearings on the War Powers Resolution. How far away is the Democratic Caucus from coming together on something on this?
Yeah. I think whether it's this week or next week, I mean, the reality is, one, we have to have language that will make sure that it can get to the Senate. And there are some questions on originally some language around privilege. Secondly, actions like last night, you pause to make sure you're going in the right direction with the right language. So the good news I can tell you is this caucus has worked with leadership, and we feel they're working hand in hand with us on our priorities, which is having a strong resolution, having Ro Khanna's proposal and Barbara Lee's proposal all moving, because all are important parts of this. So we're confident that something will happen very soon.
Thanks. My question is for Congresswoman Elmore. You introduced your own Iran War Powers Resolution yesterday. That's the same as, I think, the Kane resolution in the Senate. Are you working with Congresswoman Slotkin? And can you tell me about what the potential differences are between your version and Senator Kane's and the one that's being worked on by Slotkin?
Yeah, the resolution we introduced is the one that's authored by Senator Kane. It's duplicate. What we know, there is a commitment to moving a resolution, whether it is coming together on the one that I already introduced or figuring out an alternative option is yet to be determined. We know that Representative Slotkins has a lot of insight into what this war could mean for our country and for the region. And there has been lots of collaboration with the Foreign Affairs Committee, with Slotkin and the leadership. And so we are just going to make sure that the American people understand that we've made a commitment to work on this and that they need to stay engaged to make sure that we fulfill that commitment.
John.
Speaker Pelosi's letter indicated that this would all happen this week, and today Majority Leader Hoyer wouldn't commit to a vote this week. He said it's going to be very soon, but I'm wondering how much patience the CPC has for this to drag on into next week and get further away from the killing of Soleimani. And as it drags out, is there less urgency, and how do you apply pressure to get this moved?
I think we have consistently said this is urgent and that we want to see immediate action. Now, obviously, as Mark said, we had things happen last night that nobody was expecting, so we had to take a short pause to evaluate exactly what that was. And even as late as last night, we were still looking, as everybody was in the country, to see what was going to happen. So I think we are pushing very hard, and we do believe it will be extremely soon. We have 2 more legislative days in this week. We do want to make sure we get the resolution right, so that we have a strong force of support, and also in terms of the War Powers Resolution, so that it maintains its privilege for the Senate. So I think those are very important pieces for us, and we are working with leadership to make sure it happens as quickly as possible. I think that the threat of more actions is something that we are considering as we look at this. We need to do this quickly, because I don't think there's any guarantee that, and there was nothing I heard that said there's a guarantee that now everything's all is well. All is not well on multiple levels. And so we do need to pass this package of bills quickly. Anybody else want to add anything?
I think as important as it is to pass and to reassess, it's also important to know that we are dealing with an irrational administration. And so we have to make sure that we are reasserting our power and creating an environment where there is a balance of power. And I think we are the House of Representatives. We are Congress. We're held accountable for our actions to the people. This is the people's house, and we hear the calls every single day from the constituents that we serve, who are asking us to do something, and we have the tools to do something, and I believe we will.
Yeah. Representative Jackson-Lee.
Yeah.
I think the point to your question is that the CPC and other members of Congress are the armor bearer or the standard bearer for urgency. And I don't think any of the members here or any members that I've spoken to believe that we should cease our urgency. Right. And I do want to reflect and thank all of the proponents of the legislation. I do want to reflect on the AUMF that was utilized for Iraq. And also the vote, and I'm very glad to say that I was part of the 132, and also the vote for Barbara Lee's amendment. But I think that the point of that is that is the same war that we're dealing with today. We never solved any problems with AUMF. We left 4,000 plus, maybe 4,400 dead, and over 60,000 who came back injured in some form, and the war never ended. As I recall the language in AUMF, it deals with hostilities in Iraq. It doesn't deal with an incident or a dislike or someone in a car coming in from the airport. That is the danger of not acting, and I do think with our leadership, meaning the leadership of CPC, that we'll come together around specific answers, if you will, or documents, if you will, to vote on, because it's a question of saving lives. I want to finish on this point. As the soldiers left in the last 48 hours, families were confused. Goodbyes didn't even happen. Orders were confused as to what they might be getting into. And what has not been answered overall is not what is happening in Iran or Iraq, but that is the source of our trouble. It is that no one can dictate or determine what proxy actions will take place to threaten the lives of the American people and soldiers. What continent will it be on? What time will it be? And when you have no strategy, then you cannot in any way configure where loss of life will occur. And I'm glad no loss of life occurred last night, but the urgency is that we have to act to save lives. And I think the CPC, and I want to thank you all for your leadership, will be at the forefront of doing whatever we need to do to save lives.
Barbara Lee and then Mark Takano.
Thank you. Let me just remind you, first of all, the American people do not want another unnecessary war of choice, especially in the Middle East. Secondly, I'm the daughter of a veteran. My dad served 25 years in the Army, Lieutenant Colonel. He fought in 2 wars, and he always reminded me that we should not send our brave men and women into harm's way unless we understand the costs and consequences of that. And that's why it is so important for this administration to come to Congress if, in fact, they intend to use force anywhere in the world, especially now in Iran. Thirdly, let me just conclude by saying I serve as vice chair of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. That subcommittee is responsible for non-military solutions, preventing wars, development. We have 3 pillars of our foreign policy: development, diplomacy, and defense. And I have to reiterate again, Secretary of State Pompeo is the Secretary of State. And when you look at the course of action that he has in many ways led, and we have to ask the question, how can we begin to mount a diplomatic initiative to begin to move toward de-escalation and a ceasefire and really do the work that it takes to prevent further conflict in the region, potential further war, and somehow get back to an agenda that seeks global peace and security. And so we have to really understand that this diplomatic initiative that Pompeo should be leading is being undercut by the use of force and what is taking place in Iraq and in Iran.
Mark, and then we'll go back to questions.
Yeah. Just real quickly, I'm Mark Takano. I represent the 41st District of California, and I also chair the Veterans Affairs Committee. And, I see on a daily, I think about this daily, think about it weekly, dealing with the consequences of going to war. And I'm not eager to see our country have to contemplate, further addressing of the consequences of war. I will credit this idea with where I first heard it, which was with Mayor Pete Buttigieg, that we need to put a sunset on any AMF we pass in the future, that Congress needs to return back to a discussion on any current conflict, and it needs to be on the hook for after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years, reauthorizing current operations. That we need to what's happened is a complete shifting of mission from the original AMF in 2002, and this is mission creep on steroids that we're seeing, morphing the justification for why we're in Iraq. Was about fighting. So now, what was about ISIS now is about Iran. This is a true twisting and perversion of language, and we cannot let go of holding this administration accountable, and to not. And I urge you, the press and the American people, to not give a pass and allow this administration to just move on and facilely justify what they're doing.
We have time for one last question, Lindsay.
Has leadership given you guys a commitment that Lee and Khanna's bills will move alongside the War Powers Resolution at the same time, or either in packaged together, or would it lose the privilege if they were packaged together, but is there a commitment to do them all at the same time?
They've been working very cooperatively with us to see that all of these ideas move together, whether that means the same day or the same week, I can't say, but within a very short amount of time they would be moving together. And again, we have no reason to believe. Everything has been very cooperative and working with leadership on that.
Thanks.
I think it's just,
when we did the Yemen War Powers, when we did the Yemen War Powers resolution.
They can't get the sound.
So, I think that when we did the Yemen War Powers resolution, there was an MTR that then passed and that deprivileged the Yemen War Powers resolution from the Senate. So the Speaker, others have learned from that experience, and that everyone is working to make sure whatever we come up with gets a vote in the Senate, because if it's deprivileged, McConnell won't bring it up. So there's unanimity and urgency, but you have to do it in a way that's not going to make the same mistake we did when we did the original Yemen War Powers.
Lindsay, the problem is they won't tell us from the Senate if something is privileged until they get it. So you can't get the information ahead of time, so you've got to draft to what you think will be privileged, and that's part of the challenge.
There's also a conversation moving it on the Senate side first and bringing it here.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Yeah, appreciate being here.
Just in the last few months, you've seen an increase, not just in volume, but you've seen an increase in the types of weapons they're using, their lethality. You've seen clear intelligence that they were about to ratchet it up even further, and that there was a near-term threat against American troops stationed abroad. And I'll tell you this, I am convinced that had decisive action not been taken, we could very well be standing here today talking about the death of dozens, if not hundreds of Americans at the hands of Shia militias working as proxies for the Iranian regime.
Was there discussion about sharing any of that with the American public?
Not only am I convinced that there was a near-term threat, but that there's an ongoing near-term threat. It exists today, but it really existed back in the last 2 months of this year. It's been ongoing for a while. Again, just in the last year, we have seen an increasing willingness to not just directly engage the United States, but to inflict casualties and deaths on American troops. That is a line they were increasingly willing to cross. And that converged with all sorts of other intelligence, which I can't discuss, that I think led to the very reasonable conclusion that if decisive action was not taken, not only would those attacks occur and Americans would die, but that we would have lost all deterrence balance against the Iranians and the decisions they're making in the region.
Should the administration share some of this intelligence and make the case publicly to the American people?
Listen, I wish we could. The problem is, it's not that you try to keep secrets from people so you know something they don't. It's that if you share this intelligence, it will not take more than 10 seconds for others to realize where it came from, and not only will we lose that intelligence stream, we put partnerships, lives, and methods in danger. And understand that these intelligence streams that provide this information for us aren't just a value in the past, they're a value in the future in terms of disrupting future plots or understanding future intentions. So you cannot risk that, and that's the rationale for why some of it can't be publicly disclosed.
Did the president's address today diffuse, de-escalate tensions?
Look, I think the president appropriately responded. He didn't respond last night. He waited for the full assessment of what the attack, the damage it had done, or the damage it did not do, no casualties to us or to our allies. And I think he's responded at this point appropriately to it. And I think one of the key elements I would point to is that Iran is using the very ballistic missiles that and I think he made this point himself, that the Iran deal helped finance in terms of not just the cash that's provided, but the economic activity that allows them. I mean, how do they pay for all these Shia groups and the weapons they're providing for them? They're getting the money from somewhere. And even now, their economy under tremendous strain continues to fund these things. You can only imagine with lifting the sanctions, they had revenue at their disposal, not to mention cash delivered by the U.S. government, but they were able to divert to improving their long-range missile capabilities, but also to improving their ability to provide this weaponry to Shia militias, who in turn were using it to target Americans and our allies.
The White House is saying part of the cash and part of the funding that helped Iran have these strikes came from the Obama administration. They're blaming it actually on the predecessor of President Trump. Do you agree with that assertion?
I don't think there's any dispute. There can't be any doubt that the Iran deal allowed Iran to generate more revenue, both from commercial activity, but also that there was cash delivered to them. There's no dispute. Those are facts. It's the reason why Iran is so upset about the sanctions now. It's hurting their economy. And so, where did they didn't spend that money on bridges, roads, and infrastructure. And they're spending a lot of money. These foreign adventurisms that they're undertaking, whether it's Lebanese Hezbollah or the Hezbollah groups that exist inside of Syria, whether it's Palestinian Jihad, whether it's the Hezbollah groups that exist there, and the other Shia militias that exist in Iraq, all of these groups cost money. They are increasingly equipped with advanced weaponry that none of them, you can't buy it at Walmart, and none of them know how to make it. It's being provided by the Iranians. And that costs money. Where's that money coming from?
Part of that deal was freezing money and giving Iran back the money that it had. The way that the Trump administration is saying, and the president himself is saying that President Obama gave them cash. Do you agree with that assertion?
Well, irrespective of the origins of the money and the fact that it had been frozen, it was cash. And that cash was used. And if you look at what they spend money on, they spend money on sponsoring terrorists, and they spend money on developing ballistic missiles. I think it's absolutely fair to say that the Iran deal helped finance the capabilities they now have to launch those missiles yesterday, and the capabilities they have to target Americans using proxy groups that they believe provides them deniability. And that risk still exists. I think what's changed is they understand that when this president says if an American is killed, there's going to be a response, it's not some talking point or a tweet. It's real because of the death of Soleimani.
Senator, do you see any role for Congress at this point, legislative or otherwise?
Well, first of all, I think any help that they need in terms of continuing to ensure that we pass spending here that allows our military to have the capabilities to respond is important. I think consultations like this with Congress are also very important in terms of input that we may have and advice that we might be able to give. But if you're referring to an AUMF, that is silly, it is ridiculous. You do not need, first of all, we don't need an AUMF to react defensively. And this administration is not talking about invading Iran or starting another Gulf War or massive troop deployments for massive and extended deployment inside the territory of Iran or anything of that nature. It is talking about what it will do if we are attacked. That is called self-defense. And every president is authorized by the Constitution of the United States, not just authorized, but required to protect the United States, and particularly our men and women when we deploy them abroad. Number two, he is particularly compelled to do so when the men and women who we are protecting are deployed in Iraq under a congressional authorization. The troops that are in Iraq are there under a congressional authorization that was passed that allows them and authorizes for them to be there. But we never need congressional authority in this country to act in the defense of our troops. And that's what this administration has done. They have been very clear they don't seek to start a war. And if there is military action, it will be in response to Iranian or proxy actions, not because we started it first.
Senator, what do you say to your Democratic colleagues who say they don't see what the long-term strategy is? Regardless of what has happened in the last 24, 48 hours, where do they say that they don't have evidence of what the president wants to do to solve the Iran problem over the long run?
I don't know where they're looking, because I can tell you that it's pretty apparent what the strategy is, and that is that Iran needs to abandon any sort of nuclear weapons ambitions. It needs to stop sponsoring terrorist groups, and it needs to stop developing ballistic long-range missiles. And if it does those three things...
How do you get there?
Well, I think, guys, that's one of the reasons why we have relied on economic pressure. And you saw the president outline today the hope that other nations, particularly signatories to the JCPOA, would join in that effort. I think the strike alone points to why any future Iran deal must include ballistic missiles and the sponsorship of terrorism. I think that's the strategy. It's not a very complicated one. We want Iran to act like a normal country. All right?
Brad, you stated at the end before breaking down.
We had a good briefing that I think did address both the issues of imminence of threat and opportunity to take out a mastermind of terror that was the top terrorist operative for the #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran. Every member of the Senate, I'm on the Intel Committee, but every member of the Senate has had access since I think late May to a book of activities specifically related to this person and the rising tempo and intensity of what Soleimani was willing to do, was doing, and the number of attacks all over the world, his relationship with the Houthi, his relationship with Syria. Pretty unusual that we would have that kind of focus and encourage every member of the Senate to take the time to look at that kind of focus on one individual, and I thought it was a good briefing.
You mentioned a lot of activity from Soleimani from months and years past. Were you convinced that there was this imminent threat that required urgent action last week?
And I think we had a sense in today's briefing that they were confident that his activities were likely to come to a significant head within days of the day he was killed. One question earlier from somebody else was, well, this person's been running the Quds Force for a long time. Why was he of a greater danger than he was 3 years ago or 5 years ago? And let me go back to the encouragement of every senator to look at his activities starting in the late spring of this year. There was a different level of activity and a different willingness to take risks and engage in ways that Americans could lose life than we had seen from Soleimani before or from the Iranians in a while. Thank you all.
Hello. As I've long said, and you've heard me say for years, if Iran wanted to start a fight, the United States could end it. And that's exactly what happened over the last 10 days. Qassem Soleimani was Iran's terrorist mastermind, responsible for the death of thousands of Americans. He deserved exactly what he got, and America and the world is now safer because of it.
Senator, how would you characterize the attack that the Iranians levied back at us?
a feckless and anemic attack.
And what's your response to the president's address today? He de-escalated?
I thought Iran de-escalated. Iran didn't just take an off-ramp, they took a U-turn because they know they have no capability to fight against America, a technologically superior adversary. They also know that we will no longer allow them deniability if they try to use their terrorist proxies throughout the region. If a single American is harmed, as the president has long said, they will face severe consequences. That's what happened on December 27th, and the consequences they faced were severe. Thank you all.
It is a far cry from meeting the standard of imminent threat. They had to leave pretty quickly, so about 10 of the attending senators, 10 to 15 got to ask questions, and many others did not get to ask questions, but at least based on the presentation that was made, it does not meet what I consider to be an imminent threat.
The House is going to vote on a war powers resolution tomorrow. Do you have a comment?
Senator Menendez.
Oh, Senator Menendez.
Heads up, guys.
I went into this briefing today.
Go ahead, Senator.
I went into this briefing today with some critical questions that I wanted to hear the answers to. The imminency of the threat, the nature of the threat, the intelligence that would lead us to understand that eliminating Soleimani alone would eliminate the threat. And I walk away not only unsatisfied, but it draws real concerns for me that we do not have the type of information that is critical for members of the United States Senate to make.
Secretary.
Don't feel too bad. That's what they did to us as well. They closed the briefing rather quickly. So, anyhow, we have more questions than we have answers at the end of the day.
Just a quick, I'm Tom Carper, Delaware. Just a quick history lesson. 5 or 6 years ago, the idea came up, well, why don't we try to negotiate a deal to reduce the likelihood that Iran will develop nuclear weapons. Some folks in this body thought that was a bad idea. Actually, some folks in Iran thought that was a bad idea. They thought that they should not engage with us. But they did, and we did, and we reached an agreement called the JCPOA. It worked. Among the people in Iran who thought it was a bad idea, who thought they should not negotiate the JCPOA, was Soleimani. They thought it was a bad idea to negotiate, a bad idea to actually enter into that agreement. You know what happened with that agreement? Iran kept the agreement. 17 rounds of inspections, 17, no, they kept their word. There were elections 3 years ago. You know what happened in those elections? The moderates swept the field. Elections, city councils, mayors, the parliament. Today, the moderates have been diminished. And you know who's been raised up? The radicals, the Ayatollah, people like Soleimani. That is not a victory. At least that's not the kind of victory I think we want.
So, Senator Murphy, Senator Merkley, and I, and others, we just want to make a few comments about our takeaway from this briefing. You know, we can read about the judgments administration officials make in the newspapers and in the media. These intelligence briefings are supposed to focus on facts behind the judgments so we can make an independent evaluation.
of the judgments that are being made. And I would say that the briefing was incredibly thin on facts, and to the extent that they provided facts, in my judgment, they did not support any claim of an imminent threat that would justify the actions they've taken with respect to eliminating Soleimani. And it's important that you have that justification. It was one they gave. I did notice in President Trump's remarks at the White House today, he mentioned that they were engaged in planning attacks. The president himself didn't use the word imminent this morning at the White House. And it's an important distinction because I just want to think about everyone to think about this. We're engaged in a very, very tense situation with Iran even before the latest actions. The United States military plans what targets it will hit under certain circumstances. It's not surprising that the Iranians will also determine what targets they may hit if they are attacked by the Americans. So the idea that people might be planning to take certain actions is not surprising, just as we plan to take certain actions under certain circumstances. So the takeaway from my perspective is that they did not establish in any way the facts that would support the claim of an imminent threat that was posed, meaning that someone had decided to attack U.S. forces and kill lots of Americans. Let me turn it over to Senator Burke.
Yeah, let me concur with Senator Van Hollen's analysis. I was deeply surprised at the lack of information presented by the administration regarding a specific imminent threat. This appears to me to be a strike of choice by this administration, one that likely would have required congressional authorization beforehand. The consequences of this strike already in the first 6 days have been cataclysmic. Our troops are being pushed out of Iraq. Iran has started its nuclear weapons program again. All counter-ISIL operations have been halted. There are serious political consequences to the decision that was made. Surprised and saddened to not have that information before us. I think it is likely because it doesn't exist. But the fullness of the briefing is complicated by the fact that it only lasted 75 minutes. After waiting 6 days, the administration barely gave 100 senators an hour. We left with multiple important questions that were still unanswered. And I frankly think it's not just unacceptable to not present intelligence, if it exists, but it's also not sufficient to give the United States Senate just over an hour of time to explain a military action that likely has grave long-term consequences for our security.
I'm just going to say one thing and then let my colleagues take over. There were so many important questions that they did not answer. We did not see a satisfying plan for the future. We had 97 senators there. 15 got to ask questions. As the questions began to get tough, they walked out. I've asked for a commitment that they all come back within a week. We have not yet gotten that commitment. Thank you.
One of the things that was very troubling is there was no indication that there was due thought given to the consequences of the action. Before the action against Soleimani, we had massive protests in Iran against the Iranian government, and now we have massive protests against the U.S. No clarity that this was understood how it would affect the unity for the radicals and undermine the moderates in Iran. No sense that they had considered that the fact of an attack in Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government would undermine the authority of the Iraqi government, which had a formal relationship with the militias. No sense that they would interrupt, if you will, the training of the troops who are taking on ISIS. No sense of how this would impact the increase in nuclear refinement being done, enrichment being done by Iraq. No sense that they had considered how this would put the assets of our allies at risk. In fact, quite frankly, there was no presentation at all of a comprehensive understanding
of how the consequences might hurt all of our strategic initiatives in the region. And in that sense, this was very frustrating. It seemed to reflect a very rushed and reckless action.
In addition to what my colleagues have said, as we look forward, one of the things that concern me as well is that looking at the new race to a nuclear weapon for Iran and the fact that the president has said he will not let that happen, when asked whether or not they would come back to us before taking action going forward, they weren't willing to answer that. So what is the threshold? What happens when the intelligence says that Iran is within 6 months or 3 months of a nuclear weapon, and they then choose to take action? Does that require congressional consent? I would argue yes, it does. And we had no indication at all from them that they might feel they needed to come to Congress to get support for that action. It was deeply concerning today.
The last thing I would say is I think we all know that Iran and Soleimani's strategic objective in Iraq has all along been to push out the United States and reduce our influence in Iraq. They've been very open about that for years. And our strike, what we did, actually is allowing Iran and Soleimani in death, not in life, to be able to accomplish that objective because we've already seen actions calling for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. There is no doubt that our position in Iraq today is weaker than it was before. And I think we are all seeing the result of that right now.
Can you explain why it seems like Republicans had a totally different briefing, that they seem convinced that there was this?
They'll have to explain to you that.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I just sat through one of the best briefings I've had since I've been here in the United States Congress. You had people who gave absolute, crystal clear information that the president and the national security people had when they made the decision to take out Soleimani. What you come away with after listening to the Democrats question these people is there is so much hate and vitriol and animosity against this president that they are willing to put at risk lives of American citizens and American military people. After listening to the information that the president had, the CIA had, the security people had, the people who do intelligence work had, it would have been negligent, it would have been reckless, and it would have been an intentional disregard for the safety of Americans for the president not to act and not to take out Soleimani. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir.
I'll forward you what I
Strike the same. Pay the extra. Okay, we're together. Good luck, honey.
How did you feel after?
I came away from this briefing, I don't know what my colleagues have said, I came away from this briefing really angry, deeply dissatisfied that after waiting this long for the facts that justified the killing of the second in command of a foreign government, that the answers were unacceptably vague and unspecific. In fact, my takeaway from this briefing was that it raised more questions than it answered. I have more questions now than I did before I went into this briefing. And frankly, I am hopeful that the situation is de-escalating, but in some ways I'm more frightened about this situation than I was before.
What was so vague and unimpressive about it?
The same question was asked multiple times and the same answer given.
What was the question?
But that question
was essentially unanswered. And I can't go into what, as you well know, I can't go into what the questions were and what the answers were. I can tell you that I would not have accepted this kind of briefing if I had been a state official, as I was for many years, and I were appearing before a judge in our court.
Why do you think all the Republicans have all come out here and said it was a great briefing, they learned a lot? Senator Rich said it was one of the best briefings he's ever had since he's been in Congress. Why such the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on this? Why do you think?
My fear is that our national security has fallen victim to the polarization that we've seen on so many issues. But my hope is that we can come together on a path that de-escalates the potential military confrontation that we saw building over these last few days.
Thank you, Senator. Suppose you two feel differently.
I'm not sure what he said. I'll tell you how I feel, and then Senator Paul is going to share how he feels. We just left the briefing, and we were talking about Iran. I want to state at the outset, I support President Trump. I support and respect the manner in which he has approached his commander-in-chief powers. I believe that more than any other president in my lifetime, President Trump has shown a lot of restraint. He's been reluctant to get us involved in wars all over the globe. He's been very mindful and respectful of the fact that when the American people are asked to give up blood and treasure, they're sending off their sons and their daughters, their moms and their dads into battlefield. And he's therefore very careful about it. I respect that enormously. My comments at the moment are not directed toward the attack that occurred on Friday. We'll leave that to another day. I will say that we were brought into this briefing today to talk to us about that attack on Friday. I had hoped and expected to receive more information outlining the legal, factual, and moral justification for the attack. I was left somewhat unsatisfied on that front. The briefing lasted only 75 minutes, whereupon our briefers left. This, however, is not the biggest problem I have with the briefing, which I would add was probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate. What I found so distressing about that briefing was that one of the messages we received from the briefers was, do not debate, do not discuss the issue of the appropriateness of further military intervention against Iran. And that if you do, you'll be emboldening Iran. The implication being that we would somehow be making America less safe by having a debate or a discussion about the appropriateness of further military involvement against the government of Iran. Now, I find this insulting and demeaning, not personally, but to the office that each of the 100 senators in this building happens to hold. I find it insulting and I find it demeaning to the Constitution of the United States, to which we've all sworn an oath. It is, after all, the prerogative of the legislative branch to declare war. Article 1, Section 8 makes that very clear. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 69 made clear that this was a sharp contrast from the form of government that we had prior to the Revolution, a form of government in which the executive, the king, had the power to take us to war. He did not need the Parliament to weigh in on it, to support it. That was the Parliament's job after the fact, after we had gone into war. This, Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, is exactly the reason why this power was put in Article 1, Section 8, in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. When we send our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into harm's way, we owe the American people the decent courtesy to follow the Constitution, to debate and discuss these actions. For them to tell us that either through a War Powers Act resolution or otherwise, for us to debate and discuss these things on the Senate floor would somehow weaken the American cause and embolden Iran in any other actions, I find very insulting. Now look, I hope that they'll come back and they'll say,
No, you misunderstood us. We didn't say that at all. I wish I could believe that. I will note that when those words were uttered, not one of the briefers stood in objection. Not one of the briefers pushed back on that and said, we want to make clear that this is still the constitutional prerogative of Congress. I also want to make clear that I walked into that briefing undecided as to whether to support the resolution under the War Powers Act introduced by Senator Kaine. Now, Senator Kaine and I have had some discussions. I've got some concerns with some of the language, particularly in some of the whereas clauses that he's introduced. He's agreed to make some changes. And I can say that after that briefing is what changed my mind. That briefing is what brought me on board, together with the amendments that Senator Kaine has agreed to make. I'm now going to support it. I walked into the briefing undecided. I walked out decided, specifically because of what happened in that briefing. It is not acceptable for officials within the executive branch of government, I don't care whether they're with the CIA, with the Department of Defense, or otherwise, to come in and tell us that we can't debate and discuss the appropriateness of military intervention against Iran. It's un-American, it's unconstitutional, and it's wrong. And I hope and expect that they will show greater deference to their own limited power in the future, and to the power that belongs to Congress. This is not about us, it's not about any one of us. This is about our fidelity to those we represent. These powers are not ours. They don't belong to any of us. But when we allow them to be exercised through the wrong branches of government, with the wrong process, when you don't have debate and discussion, you don't allow the process itself to correct itself for the American people who will be most affected by these decisions to weigh in. That was insulting. That was demeaning to the process ordained by the Constitution, and I find it completely unacceptable. On that basis, I've decided to support Senator Kaine's resolution, subject to the minor amendments that he and I discussed earlier today. Senator Paul.
Thank you. I joined Senator Lee in making the decision to also support the War Powers resolution. I wanted to hear the intelligence first. What I hear was less than satisfying, but one of the arguments that's been bandied about in public I think is particularly insulting to logic, the Constitution, and the intent of our founding fathers. The argument has been made that the use of authorization of force voted on in 2002 to go to war with Saddam Hussein and his government is justification for anything they want to do in Iraq today, including killing an Iranian general. I see no way in the world you could logically argue that an authorization to have war with Saddam Hussein has anything to do with having war with people currently in Iraq. I think we need to have a debate about the separation of powers. I, too, am a supporter of the president. I consider myself to be a friend of the president. I think the president's instincts on trying to show restraint and keep us out of war are good. I frankly think he will not unnecessarily escalate things. However, the debate is bigger than just this debate. The debate is a 70-year-long debate that began in 1950 with Korea and Truman. This is a debate, and many have written that Congress has abdicated their duty. Today, this is Senator Lee and I stepping up and saying we are not abdicating our duty. Our duty under the Constitution is for us to debate when we go to war, and we, for one, are not going to abdicate that duty. We'll be happy to take questions.
Could you guys, I know there's very little you can say about the details, but could you give us a better sense of who exactly was saying this to you, that you should debate this? Was it all of them? Was it a specific cabinet member or agency director?
You know, before I comment on that publicly, I'd really like to have a conversation with the president so I can make him aware of what we were told and by whom. But I will say that the messages we received didn't get any pushback internally from the briefers. What we were told over and over again was, look, this action was necessary. This was a bad guy. We had to do it. And we can't have division. We can't have dissension within our ranks, within our government, or else it sends the wrong signal to the Iranians. And I think that's completely wrong. They were asked repeatedly, what, if anything, would trigger the need for the administration to come back to Congress for a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force. At one point, I believe one of the briefers said something along the lines of, I'm sure we could think of something. But they struggled to identify anything. They were asked specifically, well, what about if you concluded, well, it's not my point to get into that here. I don't want to accidentally say anything classified. My point is, they were asked a number of hypotheticals about situations in which they might have to appropriately come and ask for authorization for Congress. Not once did they say, yes, we need to do it in that circumstance. At one point, one of the briefers said something like, don't worry, we'll consult you. Well, with history as our guide, consultation isn't necessarily the same thing as authorization for the use of military force. A declaration of war or an AUMF is what the Constitution requires, and drive-by notification or after-the-fact lame briefings like the one we just received aren't adequate.
Do you think the president should have carried out this attack against Soleimani?
Look, I'm still agnostic as to that, Manu. I still haven't had the questions answered that I came into that briefing expecting to ask. They left after 75 minutes. Now, I understand these are busy people. They've got a lot of demands on their time. They're appearing before a coordinate branch of government, responsible for their funding, for their confirmation, for any approval of any military action they might undertake. And they had to leave after 75 minutes while they're in the process of telling us that we need to be good little boys and girls and run along and not debate this in public. I find that absolutely insane. I think it's unacceptable. And so I don't know what they had in mind. I went in there hoping to get more specifics as far as the factual, legal, moral justification for what they did. I'm still undecided on that issue, in part because we never got to the details. Every time we got close, they'd say, well, we can't discuss that here because it's really sensitive. We're in a skiff. We're in a secure underground bunker where all electronic devices have to be checked at the door, and they still refuse to tell us. I find that really upsetting.
Did you get a sense that they were not taking it seriously, almost like they didn't want to be there?
No, look, the fact that they were here shows they were taking it seriously. But some of the underlying questions did not appear to be taken seriously by some of them in some of what they told us.
Who did most of the talking on their side? Was it mostly Secretary Pompeo?
No, I would say there was, the time was pretty evenly distributed between the briefers.
So Pompeo is a former member of the House. Do you think he no longer respects members of Congress?
I'm not going to speak as to the subjective mindset of any of the briefers, as to whether they respect us or not. I know only that I came in there with a lot of questions, and that when I left, those questions remained unanswered. And I walked out of there not only without answers to all the questions that I had, but having been told that we shouldn't debate this too much because it might be harmful.
Have either of you read the House Democratic War Powers resolution that's going to be brought up for a vote tomorrow?
I haven't read that. I've read Senator Kane's resolution.
You welcome the debate at least, if they send something over?
Sure. Look, after today, every time they pull a stunt like this, I'm willing to consider and introduce any and every War Powers Act resolution.
Senator Paul, you mentioned that they used the justification of the Iraq AUMF. So were they basically arguing that because the strike took place on Iraqi soil, that covered? I don't want to discuss anything they said in there. The only reason I mentioned that is it's been in the newspaper also. I think it was Blair, the National Security Advisor, argues that 2002, the authorization to go to war with Saddam Hussein authorizes them to do whatever they want. So they have justified the killing of an Iranian general as being something that Congress gave them permission to do in 2002. That is absurd. That's an insult. And every time someone writes that Congress needs to take back their authority on war, that's what we're here to do. Let's have the debate, and let's have some senators stand up, and let's see if we can really, truly have a debate over who has the power to declare war. The reason it was put in and why every founding father said they were taking power away from the president is because they didn't want perpetual war. The president says he doesn't want endless war. Well, the way you have less war is by having less troops in the Middle East and also by having a more fulsome debate about when we go to war. Is the president being ill-served by this national security team?
I'm not prepared to say that. I'm telling you only this administration was ill-served by this briefing today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
I feel like
Quickly, yeah.